Mark Everard, Vice President of this august institution. We're sort of in this political jam at the moment of we have localism, big society, all that BS stuff, and hierarchy. We're in a sort of a two-vector situation. I'm also director of a river trust, so I see the localism. You know, local people see problems, see solutions. Work in India, work in South Africa as well. I see that everywhere. And then the juxtaposition of the top-down politics. But it strikes me there's a bit missing from your analysis, which is bringing that competitive element, which I could almost see as the role of industry in serving or mediating that bottom-up, top-down need. How do you think that should play out in both developed and developing world contexts?
Well, as I say, I think basically all three ways of organising, all three orientations towards the world need to be present if you are going to see a sustainable future. It's a different version of the idea of sustainability has three legs, if you like, except these are the three organisational legs. And because I think each one contributes something very valuable that can't be offered from the other standpoint, that actually keeping all three in some kind of creative tension between themselves is essential. I can't really answer the question in relation to the example of the River Trust because I don't know the circumstances.
I think in terms of Ostrom versus sort of top-down politics, it's probably a more familiar example. And where does a competitive element play into? Well,
I think clearly in Ostrom's case it does tend to be a comparison between the state and the common property regime, but equally well. I mean, I think if we look at the tendency within the current sort of neoliberal framework to commodify common resources, to commodify nature, and make them susceptible to market solutions, there are certain benefits in that and there are certain drawbacks in that. And the problem with those kinds of solutions is when they go unchecked by the other two poles, in a sense, in all corners of the triangle.
What would that look like if we had a government that worked, sort of?
I don't have a crystal ball.
I'm putting you on the spot.
In all fairness, I'm hesitant to try to characterise in a way something which I am arguing would itself be emergent. But I think that that I have reasonable confidence that if we create the conditions for emergence, that we can actually evolve better systems of doing things than we have at the present.
I'm also a vice president of not this august organisation, but the IES. I had just to follow up Mark's question. I had a rather similar question in mind, actually, about your tripartite division, and I was thinking about, say, the kind of environmental challenges faced by the UK and the approaches that might be regarded as hierarchical. So, for example, I think I'd put many scientists actually into that category, as you touched on that. I think we tend to think about it as being evidence-based policy, and we want it imposed and responded to and so on, or at least adopted. And then you had this second group of competitive, and picking up what Mark said about industrial and commercial interests in that, and then your third group of sort of stakeholders, and I think, for example, the Environment Agency is very much down that line. So we've got that space. But you positioned innovation in an interesting territory, because you seem to imply it was coming largely out of the competitive space, and that would actually be... my organisation is funded by Innovate UK, what was the Technology Strategy Board, and who also regard innovation as coming largely out of the business sector. But actually I think it's much more nuanced than that, and I was going to ask you whether you thought innovation also can arise from the regulatory regime and actually from the science, because actually I think all three offer innovation possibilities, personally.
Sure. I mean, I would argue against a simple linear notion that science produces knowledge which is then transformed into technology and is then has the form of innovation. And yes, there is an interaction, and certainly at the very least there is an enabling or a blocking function that hierarchy can take with respect to the creative urges of the competitive individualist orientation. So you may want to, I think when it comes to actually exploring concrete cases, it's as important to understand how things can be situated along an edge of that triangle, not just in a corner. So if we look at something like the Technology Strategy Board and innovation policy in the UK, I would actually probably put it along the edge between hierarchy and competition. I don't think it actually has much input from the egalitarian segment, except when it is innovation that seems to be threatening that worldview of the ball on the upturned cup. And then the egalitarians will jump in to resist the innovation as a reaction against it. And that's a case where we can think about that triangle with perpendicular bisectors as ways of thinking about how things align actually in real cases. Does that answer your question? I don't mind you having more than three. What I object to is having fewer than three. As I say, there are not two sides to every argument. There's always at least three. And in fact, one of the things that I advise people is if you're only hearing two voices, go out and find the missing voice, because it can pop up and surprise you. I mean, you think about the Brent Spa situation, where basically the government and BP, if you like, hierarchy in the market, had decided on the solution to Brent Spa. They hadn't consulted the only NGO with its own Air Force and a Marine squad, and the next thing you know, Greenpeace is landing helicopters on the thing. So basically, always look for the missing voice.
Bernard Fisher, former member of council. Is there a school of thought or a worldview which is that basically these wicked problems are just too complicated to solve? We should just give up?
Actually, yes. And there is another version of this schema, which is actually generated by a 2x2 matrix along the x-axis. You have increasing density of social networks as you go from the origin away from the origin, and along the y-axis you have increasing social classification. Okay. Now you can see immediately, if you can envisage this, where you have ego-centered networks that aren't closed, little discrimination in terms of social classification, that's the competitive. Where you have strong transitive networks and classification, you've got hierarchy. Where you've got basically strong group organization but little hierarchy, you've got the egalitarians. But there's a fourth cell that I haven't talked about, which is the fatalist, which is exactly the point of view that you're taking. And there, the icon is the ball on the flat surface, and its life is like a lottery. It doesn't matter what you do, who you vote for, the government always gets in. Now, I haven't talked about that because that actually requires another hour, and I didn't have the time to do it. But basically, what happens with that constituency is the other three constituencies try to position themselves such that they can represent themselves to the other constituencies on behalf of that silent majority. So in fact, that fatalist group becomes a resource in disputes that is mobilized by the other actors. Their voice is passive. So we're talking about, that's the passive voice and the three active voices in that schema. But yes, that does exist, and that is part of the larger picture.
Thank you. Jonathan Church from Client Earth. We're an environmental law organisation, and one of the things I work on is climate change, and in particular carbon targets and things like that. You mentioned those, and I just wonder whether you think overall targets for greenhouse gas emissions are helpful, even if they're missed as kind of drivers for change, or whether you think overall they're counterproductive.
Personally, I don't think they've been very helpful. And I don't think that setting targets that people miss is necessarily a productive way to go. On the other hand, I'm not necessarily opposed to targets. I just think that the carbon emissions targets were the wrong targets. If I were going to set targets, they would be actually technology targets. Not least because I think you can get a much better sense of whether you've actually met a technology target. Have you installed a certain amount of capacity of electrical generation that's non-carbon emitting, for example? When you start to take carbon emissions targets and you start to take into account things like forestry, it starts to get very dodgy. And then you start to take in non-carbon gases and you're using carbon equivalencies and so on. Then I think it gets much harder to track those anyway. But largely because I think it's focusing on the production rather than the end of the pipe emissions that is the way I would like to see things done. I would prefer to focus on technology targets if I was going to have targets rather than emissions targets. It's a pragmatic question. It's not a doctrinaire one. I mean, I think there are cases where targets can be very useful.
Emma's in the middle there at the bottom. Yeah, you're right in the middle between everybody.
I'm Joseph Morris. I'm a master's student at the University of Ulster. I was just wondering, a quick sort of, perhaps I noticed, assuming from your lecture, I'm assuming you're sort of quite a hierarchical thinker. You talk a lot about systems, and you use a lot of quite qualitative data analysis structures to make your point about how there are three sides to every debate. So just wondering, have you ever wondered what your lecture would, or your ideas would be like if you were coming from an egalitarian perspective or from a competitive perspective?
Well, I mean, it's interesting.
Would they agree with what you said,
whether
basically?
You characterise me coming from a hierarchical perspective. I wonder what your own perspective is to see that as hierarchical, because I see myself coming at it from a clumsy perspective, which is to say, I think that what I'm arguing precisely is, in fact, that I value all three ways of thinking and experiencing the natural world and the social world. And my position is that the danger comes when one of those voices, any one of those voices, gets excluded from consideration from the point of view of trying to find solutions to these kinds of problems. So I'm not going to argue whether you think I'm hierarchical or not. That's fine, but I don't see my position as being distinctively hierarchical.
I think I'm analysing it from a hierarchical.
Okay, fair enough.
That's all. It's just you use a lot of graphs and you try and sort of plot things on a graph. It's interesting.
Yeah, but they're pictures and they've got no scales and there's no quantification in there.
John Reynolds from Sammy Consulting. Can I first thank you for a very interesting talk? I'd like to go back to the start of it where you talked about wicked issues and how they're getting more complex and more numerous. But at the same time, our ability to collect data and analyse it is getting better as well. So there's an arms race between the wicked issues and our ability to understand and deal with them. Do you think that we're going to win that arms race, or do you think we're going to be catching up the whole way?
Well, I think the problem with that arms race actually was the one that I was addressing in the editorial I wrote for The Guardian at the time of the Joburg Summit in 2002, that was referred to in the introduction to the talk, where I actually argued in self-consciously tongue-in-cheek for a science strike, precisely because I felt that what we were seeing was the promise of improved scientific information upon which to base decisions being used by decision makers to postpone decisions, saying, in a few years' time we'll have better knowledge and we'll make a better decision so let's not commit ourselves until then. And so I see that as being the danger, rather than a competition between the intractability of the problem and our ability to generate data. In fact, the example I gave of NAPAP, where there was masses of data, masses of science, some of it very good, some of it rubbish. But basically it provided what was described by at least one analyst as a smorgasbord of information from which policymakers could then cherry pick the things that matched with their own preconceived view of how the acid rain issue should be dealt with. So I think I would like to call off the arms race.
Can we just take one more question? Oh, two more then. Yeah. No, Adam and... Oh no. Yeah. Sorry. All right, then someone else and then Adam.
I'll let you finish it all off. I'm Hannah, I'm from the Science Council. Thank you so much, that was really useful. I'm interested in whether, in your opinion on local enterprise partnerships, LEPs, and yes, another iteration of local solutions, do you think that there is potential there to take some of your models for good policy making, and do you think that perhaps change could happen at a local level to then grow outwards, as opposed to seeing it as a global issue?
Yeah, I would hope so. I mean, I think one of the problems we have in the UK is that our local government is highly centralised. In basically, the Treasury has control over local government spending. Most of the power is actually in Westminster. It's not in local government. And I think one of the things that's been really interesting in the US is the extent to which, in fact, it's been local governments at the city level and the state level and the community level who have responded to climate change, not the national government. There are reasons in terms of American constitutional history as to why that should be the case. And I think part of the argument I was trying to make about the difference between the local and the global scale is that there are different ways of apprehending the world and they give different kinds of insights. And there are things which are, in fact, very well observed by satellite observation or by external scanners or by central government. And there are things that really are better managed, taking into account the perspectives of people's experience within a life world. And I think that, in fact, in giving more power to local governments and particularly to local collaborations, both with the voluntary sector and with the commercial sector, is an approach that has a lot of potential for good. Please do.
So potentially I buy into that argument that the better decision making and better politics happens in the space between those three different views. But the situation that we have, not so much in the UK, but increasingly in the United States, is polarisation between those views. So if you want to become, the Democratic candidate, you have to appeal on an emotional level to your own constituency. And in doing so, you err towards one of those worldviews, which kind of cancels out that ability to move back into the middle. And I wondered, having worked in both countries, about whether you had any optimism that we could ever move away from that kind of situation into that more consensual space.
I would hope so. I mean, I first went to the US in 1977, and I went there from a Britain that was riven by class warfare. Margaret Thatcher was on a trajectory towards power. You had conflicts between the Labour government and the trades unions and so on, the winter of discontent and all that kind of period. And I was quite amazed when I went to the US in the late 70s to see the bipartisanship that existed at that time within US politics. Most important bills had a sponsor from both sides of the House, as whether it was the House of Representatives or the Senate. When I came back to Britain in 2002, and subsequently, I was struck by how little distance there seemed to be between the parties. And I would argue that on the basis of their manifestos, not their subsequent performance, but on the basis of their manifestos at the last election, it was hard to slide a piece of paper between any of the main three political parties except on House of Lords reform and Trident missiles. Otherwise, it was basically, I agree with Nick, if you remember. Now, that subsequently divisions have emerged, but I think I think both of those situations, and in the meantime, of course, what had happened in the US was this immense polarization and the end of bipartisanship. Now, I think either a situation where you've got that, where political parties are daggers drawn and basically can't have a conversation, is extremely unhealthy. But I think it's also unhealthy to have a situation where there's not enough diversity of viewpoints in the political system. So I think basically what we've seen is, in a sense, some switching between pathologies in opposite directions over the last 30 years or 40 years. That's probably the time scale upon which we're looking for some kind of movement away from the current pathologies of both countries. I'm reasonably confident it'll happen. The question is how much damage gets done in the meantime.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up this part now, but not necessarily at the end of the evening. There will be more drinks and food upstairs, so there's an opportunity for you to continue to network. So that will be quite useful. I must just also point out that although the prize winner for the John Rose Prize can't be here tonight, there's a poster upstairs that you can have a look at. I must make some thanks, certainly to the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists for this fabulous venue. It's really nice to be here, isn't it? But also to the office, all the staff of the IS, who have really worked hard on making sure that this event has been the success that it has. And I'm going to really embarrass them now, because I'm going to ask them to stand up, because I know that you get emails from people, so I just think it would be quite nice if you have a face to put to the email. So Emma is here. You need to stand up. And Ruth. No, you've got to stand. And Robert has been with us for just 5 weeks, but is already making a huge impact as a policy officer. And of course, our CEO, Adam, who also has to stand up. Oh, and Darren. Yes, Darren. And Darren, thank you. Sorry, I didn't realise you were here. Okay, so thanks to all of you. And of course, thanks, Steve. I mean, it's been a really excellent lecture. It's been just amazing for me to see the way that you have shown us how to reframe the untamable. And I, for one, am really glad that you're on the intergovernment panel.
I'm not anymore. But thanks.
Well, you should be. But thank you very much.
This is my maiden Burntwood lecture. I've enjoyed it immensely, not least because it's been great to catch up with some former colleagues and make some new contacts. It's been a real treat to hear this evening's lecture. I think it's so rare that we get the opportunity to take a step back and think about how our daily grind in working for our clients' needs and aspirations to reduce pollution and combat climate change in what is a fairly two-dimensional way in direct response to the sorts of targets which our presenter illustrated as a fairly blunt instrument to affect any real change. So it's great to see this way of thinking, and I think it's in a lot of ways I think it's challenged a good many of us tonight to how can we bring this more three-dimensional approach to what we do and add value and affect the change that we kind of got into the business to try and affect in the first place. So yeah, it's been a real treat, and it's a privilege to have been involved, and hooray for the IES.
You know, one of the personal highlights this evening was the way Steve broke it out from a dichotomy. It's not top-down, bottom-up, which we're used to, but there are other vectors there. I mean, from a systems thinking point of view, we just need to be more sophisticated about defining the problems so that the solutions actually fit the scale of the problems rather than a very narrow two-dimensional framing. So that was great, and I'd love to have spoken to him for a lot longer. Some of the things I enjoy most about the Burntwood lecture is, obviously there's the insightful speakers, and we've been just incredibly lucky over the last 8 or 7 years to have some really good speakers. But also there's a networking. There's what's going on right behind me, where people from across sectors, from industry to government to academia, NGOs, are just exchanging, bouncing off each other. We don't do that enough. We tend to think in our narrow sectors and imagine that we can devise workable solutions individually, whereas the creativity actually happens when we bounce off each other. So I think more gatherings like this, more alcohol to get the creative processes going is always a good thing.
I think my personal highlight is actually having someone like Steve give the Burntwood lecture. I think it's very refreshing to have a completely different way of looking at environmental problems, I believe. I think the Burntwood lectures generally have been successful in encouraging people who have something slightly different to say about the whole environmental sector. And I think that their views generally over the years, sometimes they've been controversial, sometimes not so controversial, but what they have been, they've been very different, and they've been very effective at stimulating further discussions and different ways of looking at things. I think that's been very, very important, I think.
It's very enjoyable to hear from a good range of environmental science speakers and to hear from people who have got such diverse backgrounds. And for that reason, the Burntwood lecture really is, for me, as an academic teaching environmental science, a very useful venue because I can take lessons from it back to my students. Well, personal highlights from this evening were hearing the categorization of different human tribes and behaviours and how that impacts policy development in the area of environmental science, because that's and also behavioural change, the necessity to get behavioural change as a stronger direction of environmental science, because these are very important areas which we need to think about in the future.